Good morning and welcome once again to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I am Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. I am joined again by my frequent co-host Bess Goden of the Millennial Splaining podcast, and one of my favorite returning guests, my colleague Phoenix Calida. Phoenix, welcome. How are you doing this weekend?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well. How are you?
I am personally well and existentially up in the air. You know how it is lately sometimes.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I know exactly how that goes.
I do not have any personal complaints right now for which I almost feel guilty, but at the same time, I'm extremely pissed that Joe Biden told us he was building a pier to take humanitarian aid into Gaza, and then the IDF uses it to launch an attack on the city. So
Yeah,
that's all
that
I'm thinking about this morning, unfortunately.
no, I totally get that. I just I don't know. I wish there was a way to get more Americans involved because when anybody hears it, everyone gets pissed off justifiably. But I feel like it's not translating to enough action on the ground. You know what I mean? Like, there's obviously the people doing protests. There's obviously people out there, but we need more. Like, we have to figure something else out. We need an alternative way to go.
I know exactly what you mean. The good news is that BDS has become, and for those who don't know, that's the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement against Israel, as sponsored by by various Palestinian groups, both violent and nonviolent. The BDS movement is suddenly a whole lot more popular than it has ever been, with to the point that McDonald's reported significantly lower than expected first quarter earnings in 2024. McDonald's is at the top of the BDS list because they have all sorts of deals to provide food in the field to the IDF.
Wow.
Um,
It feels
so
like,
go
such
ahead.
an immediate problem, right? It feels like such an immediate problem, and we want to try to save as many lives as we can. It's sort of frustrating. Like, I understand what you're saying, Phoenix. It's sort of frustrating to, see all these movements, and I feel the energy and everybody's with you, and but it's still like it's not enough. Like, I feel like I want to, take a plane and go over there and just grab people and come back, like I feel survivor's guilt here because I just really feel like there's nothing that we can do fast enough.
Well, the speed is really the issue because there are all sorts of things we can and must and should do, and none of them are fast enough. I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah,
it really comes down to that more than anything else. The things that we can do, like the boycotts, like supporting college campus protests, like students demanding that their schools, which shouldn't be capitalist institutions in the first place. There's a good
mhm.
topic for a show, but just by itself, the amount of investing schools do with what's supposed to be education money.
100%.
But but I mean, students protesting their tuition money being used to do research for the Israeli military, we should absolutely support that. Um, I know that some people have been very critical of people involved with the organization, and I realize the organization is imperfect. But groups like Palestine Action shutting down groups that actually facilities that actually manufacture weapons for the IDF. We should be supporting that.
Yes.
There
The
are
book.
many versions of the propaganda of the deed that we should be supporting that I can't talk about on the air. And that's what I'll say on it. But none of that's fast enough, like you
Right.
said.
I will
Yeah, I
give a
think it's
shout. Oh, I'm sorry, Phoenix. Go ahead.
no, no. Go ahead.
I was just going to give a shout out to the massive protest that happened yesterday, where there was a lot of people that have been speaking out about this, the red line around the White House. There's a lot of footage. I recommend checking out Action Network, People's Forum, Jewish Voices for Peace, and Pal Youth Movement for updates on that. And it looked like it was pretty big. So
also Answer Coalition and Chuck Modi.
yes, thank you. Chuck Modi. Oh my Chuck, please don't hate me. He was on my show talking about it.
And probably and probably also facts at Facts and Fire, Afeni.
Yes, Afeni was probably there, and she was probably tearing it up too.
She's involved in almost anything going on in DC or Baltimore. She's a superhero almost.
Absolutely. She is indeed fire. But Phoenix, you were trying to say something before and I interrupted you like an ass. So please go ahead.
No worries at all. No, I was just going to say that what I'm finding interesting is how I'm almost seeing like, even though we aren't seeing like the results of the protesting, what I am seeing are results in how people are viewing things. It seems like a lot more people have suddenly got on board with like, this is the end of an empire. This is the decline of an empire. Because when you have this many people out in the streets protesting, you have something like BDS. You have people who are tweeting. You have people who are making videos. You have people who are, sharing this coverage. And the federal government is still like, yeah, we're still going to do what the fuck we want to do anyway. Go fuck yourself. I think it's very much like a wake up call for people who up until now thought like, but if you just protest, then you'll see changes. Not necessarily. And so I'm very curious to see how this translates in the long term, as far as the cultural shift that's happening of people being like, okay, maybe we aren't as free as I thought. Maybe this isn't as much of a democracy as I thought. This, maybe we don't have as much power as we thought we did, and to see how, what that leads to. Like, I'm very, very curious.
I will admit that I'm enjoying how it's dividing the far right along their lines of how anti-Semitic are they? Are they so anti-Semitic they can't even embrace Zionism and feel like they have to express support for the Palestinians? Or are they just anti-Semitic enough that they shoot out their support for Israel and fire their popular employees who support Palestine? I love confusion to the enemy like that. I admit it, I'm petty.
Yeah, I think that's been very fun to watch. What I'm noticing of that is it almost seems more like like an age or like a generational sort of situation. Like I'm seeing a lot of younger right wingers who are so anti-Semitic that it's like, fuck Israel. But it's like the older ones who generally tend to be more religious, I find, who are like, no, but that whole, prophecy, apocalypse thing, we need Israel.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure that they are going to be having some fantastic conversations this Thanksgiving.
Well, there's also a racial element that makes sense. The best example I can think of there is Ben Shapiro's outfit firing Candace Owens. Not that I'm defending Candace Owens against being fired in general, but, firing a black woman, when the white guy fires a black woman for supporting Palestine, it says things about the white guy, whether you like the black woman or not.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting to watch, and I hope that they have a lot more infighting.
Exactly.
What I will notice is that they still don't get the same type of coverage that leftists get, because anytime leftists argue about anything, it's always circular firing squad. The left, there's always all this infighting, and it's like, have y'all seen right wingers? Because
I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to say something important about this, and I don't care whether people are Marxist Leninists or anarchists or just care about other people and what they call themselves. I just want to point out that it's hilarious to me that people who insist that they're Leninist revolutionaries don't understand that the whole Leninist revolution was built by so-called leftist infighting. There was the Social Democratic Party of Russia, which couldn't get anything done, and which split into two organizations. The one, which means majority, which was originally because they were bigger. I'm sorry. The one, which means majority, which was taken out of context because they were originally smaller. It was aspirational, not true. The Bolsheviks, which meant majority, and the Mensheviks, which meant minority, which was a slur, and the Bolsheviks used to say that, well, the majority of the working people are with us, regardless of what the party says. And ultimately, the Bolsheviks advanced their position by saying, hey, look at all the times we've been right, and all the times the people who disagree with us on all sides have been wrong. And they became the only people anyone trusted. And that was because they stuck to their principles instead of trying to assume some silly position for unity.
Now, isn't that funny? Isn't that funny?
We can criticize the Russian Revolution in all sorts of ways if we want to, but it was won by people who stuck to their principles.
Listen, I'm just, people who stick to their principles are attractive to people. That is one of the main reasons that Trump got popular in the first place. I mean, it is literally like, yeah, that's it.
Trump got popular because Republicans felt lied to. Republicans have been promising us racist, misogynistic queer bashing and under-delivering for 20 years. We want someone who's going to really deliver that shit.
Yeah.
And they got it.
Point. Exactly.
I think what I was going for is that, you know, we are so afraid of pissing people off. You know what I'm saying? As like on the left, as Dems, like, you know, literally anybody who is, you know, like even central Dem over left, right? Like it's we're so afraid of pissing people off. We're so afraid of looking too left, too revolutionary. And it's just like, well, what the people who really create change don't give a shit about what anyone else thinks. They know what's right and they fight for it. End of story. It's that easy. You don't need to pussyfoot around and try to like please people and unite groups and because people will unite around you if your message is clear and it is consistent. That's what I think.
No, I agree with that 100%. And I think that we have started seeing some cultural shifts along those lines. Because even, you know, a couple of years ago, you never would have been on social media seeing this many people defending Palestine. You never would have seen, you know, this many people critiquing certain things. Like I think the last 2 years, I've seen more, I don't want to say propaganda, but anti-police rhetoric than I have ever seen in my entire life.
Yes,
and I remember Rodney King, you know?
Me too.
So I think that we are making not as much headway as I would like, but I do think that we are starting to make progress. And even, you know, as we're seeing things like language shifts, I know I bring sex work into like every single thing all the time, but even the term sex worker, like major news outlets are saying sex worker instead of prostitute. Like that is very new. That shit was not happening 10 years ago. So I do think that we are actually making gains just in general for anyone who's like left of center. So it's not, maybe not quite as hopeless as it feels, you know?
Well, I see little things that make me feel better all the time. Never as big as I want, but still little things that make me feel better. It's a few years ago now, but the International Workers of the World successfully unionized the Portland, Oregon equivalent of In-N-Out Burger, a local chain called Burgerville. And they have a union now.
Burger Bill?
Burgerville.
Burgerville? Oh my God.
Yes.
Burgerville. Sorry.
But they're like the local place if you want something a little more expensive and better quality than, you know, McDonald's or Burger King or whatever. There's always some place like that in every place. The local, more expensive fast food chain that's only in that part of the country that only the people who live there know about. That's better than all the national chains. You guys know what I'm talking about.
Oh my God! I didn't
know
Burgerville was a gated community. Shit. Sorry.
Yeah, no, Burgerville is that here in Portland. It's where people go if they want to spend a little more money for fast food that isn't crap.
That's funny. But going back to what we were saying about progress. Oh my goodness. is that I completely agree. And I want to go back to what you said, Phoenix, earlier on in the conversation too, about how we are, sort of seeing people, more and more people out in the streets, because you have more people realizing that the system doesn't work for them, and it never has. Like, that's, I think, part of an interesting progression, right? Like, if we look at, like, even, starting like with the Freddie Gray protests, into the BLM movement, like, that was a huge turning point, I think, for young people in seeing really the ass end of our government, right? Like, like, oh, like, this is what it feels like to be on the wrong side. And we are now beginning to see that every day in little ways, because we experienced, sort of a traumatic situation in the fact that there were so many protests within such a concentrated period of time. And now that we're going out into protesting for Palestine, we are seeing a lot of things that we've learned from BLM protests on the streets in Palestinian protests as well. People know to cover their faces. People know, to carry around milk of magnesia for pepper spray. People are educating themselves on how to deal with, sort of like a fascist establishment, which is beautiful in general, aside from the fact that we're fighting for Palestinian lives. So I completely agree. Yeah.
I totally get it. Yeah, I just like, because I can go on. Yeah, I think because I can go on social media at any time now, and I can see people talking about how to deal with these abortion restrictions, how to get people out of the state so they can get abortion care if they need it. I'm openly seeing people saying, "Hey, why are we spending all this? Why is so much of our city budget going to cops when we can't have libraries open?" I'm openly seeing people, saying, talking about like anti-trans legislation or anti-queer legislation. I'm seeing, like I just and it's not that people haven't always existed who have fought for these things, right? And I certainly don't mean to dismiss them, but I can't say I've ever seen it in such like a casual way. Like I'm seeing people say ACAB now who never would have said that a few years ago. It was still the people who were saying a few bad apples a few years ago were saying ACAB now, and it's brilliant.
I know the sort of thing you're talking about, and before I address what Connor is saying in the chat, because I think he's raising a good point about the white part of the country. I do want to say that a lot of people in 2020 who were very angry at me for saying that there wasn't a lot of difference between Biden and Trump, and that we were going to see a lot of the same stuff we saw from Trump under Biden, and who poo-pooed me or said that I was being hurtful or unfollowed me or in some cases blocked me, have, since the Cop City and the Palestine thing, really been anti-Biden themselves.
Yeah.
And I find that extremely, extremely heartening. Mehdi Hassan, who blocked me for saying, "But really, what's the difference between Trump and Biden?" Finally started saying there was no difference on Trump and Biden when it came to things like Palestine, and got fired by MSNBC.
Yeah. I think that also goes back to earlier what we were talking about in terms of being ideologically consistent.
Yes.
Because like that, it's starting to pay off, really.
Yes, I really think you're right.
But I'm sorry, you were going to address the comments, and I keep interrupting now. Let me stop.
No, that's okay. Connor, please correct me in the chat if I am wrong, but you live in New York State, and New York State has a reputation for being very white. Am I correct in those guesses? And this is in reference to to his comment here on the screen. Actually, I'm seeing in local politics in my town the exact opposite, in specifically GOP regression among the people in power and their supporters.
I was just going to say that I've been to upstate New York and it is pretty white. And I do have an aunt-in-law up there who is black and has definitely been harassed by her little community constantly for it.
Well, I know that Albany, New York was where the state headquarters for the KKK was. Fun fact, if anybody didn't know it. In California, the state headquarters for the KKK was in the city of... The original state headquarters was in the city of Orange, in Orange County, California. And now the unofficial headquarters for the KKK is in Santee, down in San Diego County, which is so beloved by the people of San Diego that they refer to it as Clan T.
Yeah, hearing that it started in Orange County is like the least surprising thing I've ever heard in my life.
So, fun fact, there are 3 Orange counties in the United States: Orange County, New Jersey, Orange County, Florida, and Orange County, California. Two of them, Orange County, Florida, and Orange County, California, are where the 2 national headquarters and 2 famous theme parks for Disney are located. Now, Walt Disney was famously involved in America First during the lead up to World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And as another fun fact, Orange County, New Jersey's most famous resident was the founder of the New Jersey State Police, who was an unreconstructed Nazi who based the New Jersey State Police's uniform on an apartheid Namibian military uniform from pre-World War I Germany. The same one that the people who committed the Namibian genocide wore.
Jesus Christ. Also, Hillary Clinton, I believe, has a house in East Orange.
Well, you know, I'm sure.
Just saying,
Hillary Clinton has a house everywhere now, doesn't she?
I think so.
But certainly not in poorer Black communities.
You know, somebody the other day said something that made me cry, and the reason it made me cry was because I realized how wrong it was, but in totally the wrong way. Someone said that it wasn't true that Republicans had forgotten their roots, that the ideology of Barry Goldwater was alive and well in Hillary Clinton. And it made me cry because Barry Goldwater was much more pro-queer, pro-abortion, and even, despite his problems, pro-Black than Hillary Clinton.
Shit.
Barry Goldwater is the reason that we still have that Roe v. Wade lasted another 40 years in the early 80s. Reagan could have killed it. Reagan had the power to replace one judge with a pro-abortion judge, and then replace the chief justice with the most conservative court on the bench in the 1980s. But William Rehnquist, the most conservative court on the bench, told Reagan that he would not give a blue slip for Rehnquist to. Barry Goldwater said he would not give Reagan a blue slip for Rehnquist to become Chief Justice because Rehnquist was from Arizona, Goldwater's state. Unless Reagan appointed a pro-abortion judge, and that's how we got Sandra Day O'Connor, and that's why Roe survived for so many years. Say whatever you want about the court during those years and their bad decisions, but Barry Goldwater saved abortion. No Democrat has done that much, certainly not Hillary Clinton. And it's disgusting that we have to call people out like this because the man was ridiculously right-wing in so many horrific ways.
Mm-hmm. That is wild. I was just thinking about that comment, and I'm wondering in the comment section about seeing a GOP regression in terms of, I'm wondering if that's like in terms of like local leadership, because that is something that I have seen is Republicans try to do a takeover on a local level, but all it's doing ultimately is like socially, in a social sense, like pissing people off even more because they don't want those type of policies.
Yeah.
I'm in Michigan. I'm seeing it a lot. Like, we
Yeah.
essentially protected abortion rights, but that was some shit while that was going on. And
Yeah.
a lot of these attempts, at trying to push things right wing is kind of backfiring in a lot of places. So I think that's also something to kind of be on the lookout for, because right wing policies don't help people. And I think that people, are sort of becoming comfortable with that, and understanding and accepting that and talking about it publicly more so than they have, maybe in the past, because they were doing well enough to get by. But a lot of people don't feel that way anymore,
And I think it's also worth mentioning the purple Democrats who run big cities in blue states. The best example I can think of, because I live really close to Portland, is Mayor Tear Gas Ted Wheeler over the river in Portland. Tear Gas Ted supported Mike Bloomberg for president before endorsing Joe Biden, who's been a Democrat all his life, has never been a Republican, and vocally claims to be pro-queer, but he is one of these guys who puts all the money into the cops and starves social services and arrests the homeless. And so, if you live here and you're a poor black person or a poor queer person or a homeless person whose number one fear is interaction with the police, it doesn't matter that he's a Democrat. He's made it harder for you to survive.
Yeah. And, I don't know, Connor, if you would agree with this, because I'm also working on the other side of the fence on a Green Party campaign. Christina Mirakalil is running for Senate, New Jersey. And thank you for letting me shout that out every time I'm on the show. But yeah, what we see here is that because everybody is so used to being Democrat, and this is such a blue state, everybody has to run as a Democrat regardless of their policies or actual position in life. And it feels that way in a lot of states. You could absolutely, I think, say that in a lot of red states, that there are people who sort of lean towards more socialistic policies, even though they classify themselves as Republican. And it's because they're trying to go with the popular opinion, and the media, certainly local media, is not interested in changing that. And we're so used to a duopoly that we feel like we have to assign one or the other, right? We have to pick one or the other, and we are just resigned to that as a country. I think it's a perfect storm, honestly, of BS that creates that situation. And it almost makes you look at the two-party system and go, is this even meaningless? Like, like, is there, like, there's one, no difference between the two parties, it feels, and two, is there even unity amongst the party itself about what they stand for? Because it's literally, almost like everybody for themselves, except they wear a red or a blue shirt when it suits them.
I will say that there are certain things that it does mean, and that most of those things revolve around fundraising. You notice that there is no room for even the most progressive Democrats to actually seriously criticize Joe Biden or suggest that they might not support him. We don't see the only person. This isn't like 2012, where Bernie Sanders was talking about primarying Obama as a Democrat to make a point. There was nobody progressive in the Democratic Party who wanted to run for president except Marianne Williamson, and she wasn't good enough. Now think about that.
Yeah.
There was nobody in 2024 willing to do what people talked about doing in 2012 or did in 2016 or 2020? Nobody.
Well, in some ways too, like we were talking about the culmination of um a lot of events resulting in people sort of waking up to the fascism that's been around them for a long time and is now acute. Um in a lot of ways, uh like in tandem, the people in power have had to consolidate in certain ways also. And I feel like we're experiencing the end of a dynasty in a lot of ways, right? Like the Clinton dynasty, essentially, with Biden. And, we really, it's making us rethink a lot of the things that we were taught, because the Clinton dynasty has lasted pretty much a large portion of my life and has certainly influenced the way that I learned about politics. I mean, I essentially learned about politics through watching the frickin' West Wing,
It's
which was basically written by the Clinton administration. So
almost, yeah.
it's,
Lawrence
yeah.
O'Donnell wrote for the West Wing, let's remember.
Wait, what now?
Lawrence O'Donnell wrote for the West Wing, let's remember.
Chris O'Donnell?
Lawrence O'Donnell.
Lawrence
From
O'Donnell.
MSNBC.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Lawrence O'Donnell wrote for the West Wing.
Gotcha. Yeah. There were actually a number of people, I think.
Dee Dee Myers, the
that
former Clinton press secretary.
That advised on that show. Absolutely.
But I want to point out, though, how modern Democrats fail by even the standards of the West Wing. Because people love to criticize the West Wing and call it ridiculously centrist and intellectually circular and tremendously dense and self-congratulatory. And a lot of that is true. But the first 3 seasons of the West Wing were also continually calling the liberal Democrats out for not being liberal enough. And the president, for the first 3 seasons, the president was constantly struggling to find a way in his own mind to feel like he could be more liberal, to overcome his own mental fears of losing his office and things like that. And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about that part of the West Wing because the Obama fanboys convinced the media that they were the West Wing guys making it cool to be liberal again. When in reality they were just making the same compromises with the conservatives as always.
Yes, that is an excellent point.
I've never watched that show, and now I kind of want to.
I mean, honestly, and this is
do it.
So up until the point where John Spencer dies, everybody should watch the West Wing for the comedy team that is Martin Sheen and John Spencer. Just for that. For that, it's worth watching.
They are very charming.
Well, they're funny. They're tremendously funny. There's the great line, and I still think this is, and I'm sorry for quoting a TV show in the middle of this serious show, but a senator who has an autistic kid is doing a filibuster to get money for autism research in a budget. Now, without going on into any of the specifics of the autism issue, the senator is doing the filibuster because he loves his grandchild and wants to know more about his grandchild's condition and wants that money in the bill. And John Spencer says to Martin Sheen, he's not such a bad guy. And Martin Sheen says, I don't like him. He's a curmudgeon. And John Spencer says, well, so are we. And Martin Sheen looks at John Spencer and says in a very snippy voice, really snippy, you are. I happen to be full of mirth.
That's funny.
And is a beautiful moment and a hilarious line. And it's like, you're just as bad as this dude you're bashing.
Totally.
And that of course is one of the early 3rd seasons. And in the end, they end up bailing out the senator doing the filibuster, asking other senators to come in speak for him so that he can, while he takes the question, so that he can rest and keep his filibuster going.
It was their take on Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, right?
Yes, it was pretty much. And they decided they were going to stop trying to pass their bill and support the senator based on their feeling that, you know, he was doing the right thing based on his principles.
Yeah,
and
I remember.
The first 3 seasons are full of stuff like that, where they decide to just do what they think is right. The most important plot in the first season is the determination to appoint Edward James Olmos as anti-cop judge instead of the racist pro-cop guy that everybody in the party wants them to appoint.
Right.
You know, it's so amazing, like these type of shows. I get why people get into them because it gives you some sort of escapism about how you pretend that your government actually functions. But yeah, because like as you're describing, it sounds like what you're describing is like the same reason that people watch like Law and Order.
Well, the difference is you never see anybody in Law and Order do anything that cops and prosecutors don't actually do. You see it done in a way that makes it pretend, that makes you want to believe that all the things they do are done for good reasons with the best intentions.
Yeah.
Whereas the West Wing.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
The West Wing was very aspirational in that the first few seasons were our politicians should be more like this. Why aren't they? But it got spun around, especially after the third season where Aaron Sorkin and Rob Lowe both left the show, and it was taken over by a showrunner named John Wells, who was a centrist who thought Aaron Sorkin had not been sufficiently critical enough of liberals.
Interesting. Yeah, I might actually check it out.
I love the first 3 seasons. After that, it's still worth watching for a few things, but the things that made it special are gone.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although I did stick with it longer than that. I think I
watched the whole show to the end, and I will totally admit that there was a part of me that really, really smiled when they brought Rob Lowe back at the end.
Yes, absolutely.
Because we're finally admitting what we did wrong with the show at the beginning,
right?
Sort of way. But at the same time, I mean, it was never really the same after Sorkin left.
Yeah, for sure. But
even people blame Sorkin for the West Wing, though. That's what's frustrating is people. And I'm not saying Sorkin's perfect. Sorkin is an obnoxious, annoying person. He gets too much voice in serious spaces. He's a TV writer, but at the same time, he's a good TV writer who's written some very interesting and expressive shows that really go as far as anybody can in mainstream media to try to both clarify and criticize liberal thought in America, even if it is by a liberal and not by somebody more radical like we might want.
Fair. I'm not going to sit here and lambast Aaron Sorkin. He is who he is. But I will say that because The West Wing was so popular while I was growing up, it really did shape the way that we were taught government works.
Sadly true. People thought that this was educational instead of aspirational.
Right, exactly. And to the point where we believed in our government for a time. Right?
I remember that. I remember that for a while. And that did happen for a little while Obama was president. That's true.
There is yes, exactly.
But what I always remember about the West Wing is how people who watch TV thought Martin Sheen would have made a better president than either W or Obama. And that gets forgotten.
Because he's got a team of writers tell him what to say.
But it wasn't just that. People wanted President Bartlett instead of W or Obama. This was the comment. This was the topic of of what should have been serious editorials at the time in some cases.
Oh my God. Because we really do want a white guy, but we want him to be a little bit woke. Is that it?
That's the right way to put it. That's really the right way to put it, because
and that's
Bartlett,
why we swung towards Biden hard, especially when Obama put his weight behind him in the first election.
but
right?
they also really they really do show some good things, but they do it in frustrating ways. One of the reasons that
let me make my point about West Wing real
Sure.
quick, if you don't mind. So it taught us to actually, again, it taught millennials to actually believe that our government had intentions for everyone, to make everyone equal. Like it really, like I really believed that I wanted to help the government. Like I wanted to be a part of the government when I watched that show. Like I was believing that line so hard. And I think it's unique because that kind of belief in the government really hasn't existed since the 60s and JFK. So, that's a marked difference between the Xers and between millennials. Because we really started from a place of hope and naivety, and we came up in this era of a boom period prosperity, and we thought that there was an American dream and an American promise, and then we grew up to find out that it was all a lie. So that's the point I wanted to make. Thank you for indulging me.
Well, I mean, I think every generation goes through that in some way or another. For my parents who were boomers, it was the Vietnam War era and those protests.
Well, that's exactly my point. Is that
for me and people like me, it was all the Cold War stuff going on when we were kids, all the social stuff in the 90s, the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, seeing the same stuff over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's true, yeah. But I feel like Xers grew up with the disillusionment of the Vietnam War, because that's what I'm saying is that.
Well, that's true.
Up with the same naivety about their government that millennials did. Whereas Xers grew up with the, sort of dysfunctional reality in the same way that Gen Z is now growing up with the dysfunctional reality.
I will say, because in direct response to what you're saying, it is true. Every show in the 80s, except for sitcoms, every show in the 80s was in some way about the trauma of Vietnam War veterans.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that really shaped the way you guys talked about your government as young people, the way you feel that, I mean, because again, like Gen X is very, right? Like I identify punks with Gen X, right? Like I identify that whole, right. I mean, I identify that whole, fuck you, fuck everything, like burn it down attitude with you guys. And millennials came into a situation where we didn't need to burn it down at first because we were doing okay. And then when our lives started getting shittier and shittier, we thought we could get it back. We still do. We still think we can build it back. That's why the fuck I joined the Green Party. We still think we can build that back, And now we're seeing that it was always a lie and a farce. And the lie that we were sold is crumbling around us. So anyway, I think Xers have an interesting affinity with Gen Z because of that, because their worldview developed in a period of, I guess you could say, disillusionment, right? So yeah, I'll end it. I'll end it there. But Phoenix, did you want to jump in? I feel like we've been talking too much.
No, I was just going to say that I think with millennials, it's like very hit and miss with what you're talking about in terms of if you came up feeling disillusioned or not. I know that, like, for me in my own personal experience, I hit the disillusionment early because of the crime bill in the 90s. So like I went into adulthood like fuck the fucking government, fuck the cops, like and that's probably honestly like that type of situation is probably why I never actually did watch shows like West Wing, because I was like, oh, this is going to be some bullshit propaganda trying to make me think the government cares about me, and like I just didn't tune in. It's the same reason that I don't tune into shit like Law and Order or like police procedural shows in general. But I think that it was like very, I don't know. I think the disillusion got to me very early, because of like the economic factors and the social factors of where and how I was coming up. And so like it's always like fascinating for me when I hear other people's perspectives to be like, I thought things were fine at the time, and I was like that. Like it's so interesting how
I really.
Well, wait a minute. Let me ask you a question. Clarify that.
You guys keep going.
Let me ask you a question to clarify that. When did you come into adulthood? When did you turn 18?
I graduated high school in 99.
In 99. Oh, okay. Actually, You're a little bit older, so that completely nullifies what I was going to say. Great. Cool. I take your criticism and I accept it. I absolutely agree that is a perspective from which I was speaking. I grew up in a private school situation, and you're right.
You can't underestimate the degree race and class come into this stuff and affect our perceptions. Speaking as a Gen Xer, I grew up with a lot of disillusionment on one hand, but I also grew up with a lot of optimism about how, oh yeah, America's great. We've done all these things. We were able to kick out Nixon. We got out of Vietnam. Things could be better. And that there was some of this feeling even while Reagan was president. And sadly, Reagan tapped into that optimistic feeling that people wanted to feel better than any liberals were able to. Partly because that was when neoconservatism had really taken over the Democratic Party and started to destroy the difference between Democrats and Republicans. I can't talk about the 70s enough.
No, I totally get that, and I very much agree. But yeah, and I didn't mean it as like an insult to be like, that was not my experience, but just it is always, I think, good to get multiple perspectives, because it, I think, helps clarify things and like really put things in perspective, because it's very easy to get caught up in like, well, I was either raised this way or I was not raised that way, and you just sort of assume everyone had like a similar experience. A lot of people didn't. And so I think it's always like really helpful to talk to people from like different backgrounds, different perspectives, who came up differently, because like the wild part is we all ended up on the same page, because like this shit is not working, the system isn't working, and it's like even if there were like specific differences, we all ended up here, and I find that to be remarkable and fascinating. You know what I mean?
I do, and I think it's amazing sometimes.
Yeah, totally. And it's definitely a mark of how far the collapse has fallen. And there's no need for you to apologize. I absolutely I absolutely take your note, and I agree. And the other thing is that the perspectives that we've heard from the millennial generation has been so kind of few and far between that we really only hear the privileged perspectives from millennials, right? We don't really hear, from the other side of the tracks. We don't really hear, we're a more multicultural generation statistically speaking, but there is a certain network of privilege that you need to either be born into or network your way into to get a hold of the microphone. That is something that I think a lot of us are wrestling with as now that we're older, because we're starting to realize that the world is shifting, and we are starting to hear other perspectives, and we're starting to really understand how true that is. You know what I'm saying? Like, again, what you just said was another moment of clarity for me on that same issue. And I think a lot of us are going through that too, because we didn't hear alternate perspectives. We barely heard our perspective. Our perspective, was technically the alternate perspective, because everybody's voice was a boomer. And they all spent their time shitting on us for being lazy assholes, and that's all we thought about. You know what I'm saying? Like,
No, absolutely.
yeah, I think this is a perfect time in our lives to come together as a generation and start really talking about the differences in our differences.
One of the most important things to remember about generational conflict is that the older generation always says the younger generation is lazy and ungrateful. And the younger generation always says that the older generation is greedy and authoritarian and reactionary.
Yeah, but
and the fact is both sides are right, and we should generally side with the younger generation.
Yeah. But my comeback to that is that it hits different during different economic periods, right? I mean, like, if like as millennials, we were experiencing that during an economic collapse from a very solid boom period.
Well, and this is really a good point. The Reagan years were so good for some people that it was really easy for people to believe that everything was okay because it was good for them. And as a result, it was really easy to forget all the people who were being aggressively oppressed by the forces that brought us Reagan.
Absolutely. And I don't just, I think that happens no matter what. That's absolutely an eternal issue. But my point was that when older generations criticized us and blamed us for like the collapse of the economy, they used it to keep us out of jobs.
Yes, they're shifting the blame because they have the power, and you were, but it's the younger working people who take the consequences. So they shift the blame to the victims.
Let me finish my point real quick. I'm sorry. I just don't want to keep forgetting what I'm trying to say. That's all. So, so it's not just about being a scapegoat. It's also about using, like, it's also about like the decision to hoard money as a richer class and not expand their businesses, not invest in their people, I mean, there are periods in which you can see like in the in the 90s and the early 2000s, you can absolutely see that companies were interested in investing their employees. They were interested in paying for training. They were interested in a lot of things that don't exist anymore. And that there is a reason that they don't exist anymore, and that reason is their scapegoating of us. They kept us down on purpose. They specifically changed jobs that were paid to unpaid internships and then sold us unpaid internships with the promises of a job. There is so much labor that was transferred from paid normal everyday salaried positions to freelance positions, to part-time jobs. I mean, we're talking about a major shift in the workforce and how it functions here. And so because boomers were able to use us as scapegoats, they were also able to tell us, no, you can't have the jobs. No, you can't be trained into doing this job. And they had an excuse to get to consolidate what would used to be 5 jobs into 1 job, because millennials weren't good enough and they had to use the people that were good enough who were older and experienced. So that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I do think that it's definitely worth noting that. And I think that there is a lot of resentment that millennials have. And I've got to be honest, I think a lot of it is justified
Yeah.
because there was the hoarding of power, there was the hoarding of resources, there was the hoarding of wealth. But, and it's as if that wasn't already bad enough, right? Because, like, if you want to, like, radicalize a young person, let them talk to a boomer about, like, working and, you know, you didn't have to do all this extra stuff. You didn't necessarily have to work off the clock. You got a fucking pension. Do people even get pensions anymore? Not a 401k, a fucking pension.
Well, let me answer that question. I work
Yes.
I work for a national company that is still run by the family that founded it, and as a result is somewhat better to work for than some of the more corporate outfits. But at the same time, they are violently anti-union. They are violently anti-organized employees. They're against paying people more money beyond basic annual, what they call merit raises, which are, of course, confidential for individuals. And,
okay, let me ask you a question.
And most importantly, they completely phased out pensions a few years ago so that the last people who had pensions retired during my first couple of years working there. So the people who were part of the pension program are all retired, enjoying their pensions, and the people who are still working there all have 401ks.
Do you own your house?
No.
No? Okay.
Never been able to buy one. Can't afford it. And when I could afford it, my credit wasn't good enough.
Okay, that's fair enough. Do you I don't want to ask you how much you make, but I want to ask you how much you make. Like,
I make less than median. So median for a single individual is 50,000, and median for a family is about 75.
mm-hmm.
By myself, I make about 49.
Mm-hmm.
My wife and I together make about 60,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
That's bringing her disability into things.
Okay, 49 is more than I've ever made.
Sure.
Way more. Like, I couldn't use at a job that much.
And not enough to pay my rent here, which is the sad thing.
I know. And I'm not saying that you're doing better. I'm not saying that,
oh, I know,
you know, like that anything is better for you other than,
well, I mean, some things may be better for me, and you know, I'm not going to deny that some things might be better for me.
Had a foot in the economy before shit went south, and we didn't. You know what I'm saying? To the point where, like, go ahead, Phoenix. Maybe I'm not phrasing this correctly.
No. I know exactly what you mean, and I just wanted to like add on like my own little personal caveat is when we have these conversations, something that like just drives me up the wall is that there's always like this sort of gaslighting element to it. A lot of times, older folks will be like, "Well, we worked just as hard as you. We didn't have more opportunities, or we just." You know, you're not looking hard enough for opportunities. And it's like, no, the job landscape has changed, the political landscape has changed, the economic landscape has changed. And so I think that adds a lot of times like an extra level of animosity to the conversation because
I'm
it's like,
I'm going to say something else, which I think really matters, and I think not enough people are willing to say. Things have gotten better for me over time because I am a white man who has built experience and confidence. And those benefits do not necessarily accrue to a black man or a black woman my age.
That's a fair point.
Right. True. That's very, very true.
Although,
but yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, like I just feel like there's always, like not right now in this immediate conversation with us, but in general, when like millennials and younger people are talking about trying to get by, it's just like there's always this like wild ass amount of gaslighting, and I hate it. And I think it actually detracts from the conversation because it's like, now you're just lying to me to tell me that like nothing has changed.
Well, this is why I make the argument that this generational argument always happens every generation. Right. Not because I'm trying to minimize it, but because I want to make a point that it's not really a generational argument, even though it takes that form. It is really a class argument. It is just that the people who speak for and make decisions for and are publicly visible in the ruling class are, for the most part, older people. Now, there are exceptions, but most of our politicians are older than me. While there are some younger billionaires like Bezos and Musk and some others, most of our billionaires are older than me.
Yeah, there's a reason for that.
And so it's a matter of the elder generation of the ruling class has accumulated a lion's share of the resources because they have had more time to do so. Other members of the ruling class respect their authority and experience, and therefore it appears to be a generational conflict when it's really a class conflict.
Okay, so let me rebut that if you don't mind. Firstly, I will say that smells just a little bit of class reductionism when we're trying to tell you that we're trying to make a point that we feel is unique to our generation. And we are also telling you that we are used to being gaslit when we try to do so.
But that's the whole thing. I'm not saying that it's not unique to your generation. I'm saying that it is that every generation has this experience. So while the specific sets of experiences are unique, the conflict is constant. It is an ongoing, never-ending cycle.
I mean, I can't disagree with you because that's a very broad stroke. But what I can say is that, and also let me say that I acknowledge the point that there has always been tension between generations, and things have gotten worse since the Industrial Revolution, because we don't live in the same kind of family units that we used to, and we are starting to be educated amongst peers of our own age rather than with our family units or our small communities. So I agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. But the point that we're trying to make, I think, is that let me put it in perspective. Let me put it in perspective for you using boomers compared to Xers. Okay. So it's true that boomers at some point experienced the recessions, right? But every time they did so, the recessions got a little bit worse and a little bit worse. Okay.
Oh, definitely.
And every time there was a recession, there was a boom period before that, to the point where they were able to accumulate enough to make it through certain periods and able to platform. You know what I'm saying?
The real difference is government relief. Not the boom, but the government relief.
Let me just finish my. So I again am drawing broad strokes here, but you can see the trend statistically speaking. Okay, like I cannot argue you that there's a serious class problem in this country and always has been. I cannot argue you that it's not getting better. I cannot argue you that it's been consistent during the 20th century, but somewhat consistent, fluctuating, obviously. But my point is this: that the boomer generation, okay, was able to accumulate wealth during periods of boom times to gird themselves.
Some of them, yes.
Of recession. And you can see statistically, if you look statistically at how financially boomers are doing in comparison to Xers, in comparison to millennials, you can see that each generation is doing more and more poorly.
Those numbers are true to some extent, and to some extent based on the way generational wealth works.
Well,
and generational wealth is a class issue even more than it is a generational issue. And I'm not trying to say that there aren't real differences between generations, or that age doesn't matter. But it's really important. And this is where a lot of gaslighting tends to pick up a lot, when people try to say that their generation had it worse than younger generations, and when it's not true. Usually their generation had it better than younger generations.
I'm
but
not trying to
at
flip.
the same time, I want to talk about class differences between boomers, because a lot of the general broad strokes we're talking about are true if you consider averages and medians that are based on the richest boomers, because the richest boomers have kept more of what they have accumulated than anybody else their age, and have had more time to accumulate than anybody younger than them. But you also have boomers who lost everything during a recession in the 70s or the 90s or the Great Recession in 2008, and they've never recovered from it.
That's true. That's a valid point. I'll give you that.
There are boomers who were homeowners before the 90s or the 2008 who have never owned a home since. There are boomers who had great jobs before they had to retire and are now living in enforced poverty.
Mm-hmm. I could agree.
All of the things that are impacting us are impacting boomers too. Some boomers not as much as others, but you never get away from the basic facts of class, no matter how much you have to acknowledge that race and age and gender are class issues.
Yeah, I would.
And
agree.
that's the real difference. It's not that identity politics is bad. It's that identity politics has to be class conscious too.
Absolutely
Because
agree with that.
white people are not my friend. Rich white people are not my friends because they're rich.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Rich black people are not necessarily Phoenix's friends because they're rich.
Right.
Rich young people are not necessarily any of our friends because they're our age or younger. Look at Sam Bankman-Fried.
But I still don't. I acknowledge everything you're saying, and I specifically acknowledge the fact that you are calling me out on using averages, rather than, that are based on
Because those averages don't represent the majority of boomers any more than they represent the majority of millennials. Because if you went by averages or medians, there are a lot of millennials doing better than you, and we're supposed to believe that means all millennials are doing better than Gen Z, just for a comparison.
right. That's an excellent point, and there. I definitely don't, however, think that we can say that isn't a trend.
It's absolutely a trend. And
Right.
This is why age is a class issue.
Well, yes, I agree that it's intersectional. I absolutely agree it's intersectional. And I absolutely agree that when we are tracking these things, we are tracking the most prosperous generation.
And I want to speak to this in sort of like vulgar academic theoretical terms.
I think that it's important to note, however, that when you compare rich people to rich people, that you are also comparing apples to apples and are more able to identify trends.
Yes,
so I do
agree.
think that actually reinforces what I'm saying also.
Up to a point. On one hand, the richest people in the world are millennials. But on the other hand, the majority of the richest class in the world are older.
Yeah.
In really basic economic terms, it falls back on the phrase capital tends to accumulate.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add the term over time. So if you have a lot of capital in the first place, you're going to get richer faster than people with less.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the more time you have to accumulate, the richer you will get. So the richest members of any class, with other controlling factors taken into account, are nearly always going to be the oldest because they've had the most time to accumulate with those other controlling factors taken into account to allow for exceptions.
That's true.
Yeah.
However, some of the statistics that I was looking at was how each generation was doing at a certain age group. So how boomers were doing financially when they were 29, how Xers were doing when they were 29, how I was doing when I was 29.
Sure.
Those statistics I've compared, and it is true that we've been getting worse and worse since the boomers.
Now that is true.
So
With
again,
another
I would just add
to ask Phoenix what she wants to say, because I feel like we've been talking.
No, I would just add that one of the caveats I find about this particular conversation is that, yeah, it is important to consider the time factors because they do have more time to accumulate wealth. I would just add that I feel like boomers also had more opportunities and more ways to accumulate wealth than we do. Just because it was a different type of environment. It was a different economic landscape at the time. And so, like, I think that is a factor that's not always addressed in these type of conversations.
This is where government assistance becomes tremendously important, because boomers are the generation that got it.
Right. Like, so, I mean, I can only speak from my own experiences, right? But, I went through foster care, and I remember talking to, one of the families. They were, middle class white family in the suburbs. And the stories they would tell were just like the wildest shit I've ever heard. Like, I don't know anybody who had that type of sort of like generational privilege, like compared to millennials. Because one of the things, when they got their first car, they had just gotten married, and he had a job with I forget who before. Who was it before? It was AT&T, right? It was like
AT&T. AT&T was the name for the long distance arm of what was called Ma Bell.
That was it. That he worked there, and he was telling me. Yeah, he was telling me that, like, when he got his first car, he didn't put down a down payment on it because he had a job there and he was married, and they're like, yeah, they're obviously, like, you're a qualified candidate. I don't know a single millennial who could walk into a car dealership
my parents
with a new car. Like, what?
No, that's the same thing. My parents were able to buy a new car and a new house when they got married with the help of their parents.
Yeah. And so I just feel like those sort of things, like, as we're talking about long-term accumulation, it's easier to get that long-term accumulation when you have those types of privileges, and it's just
and this is where I want to say my parents were white, and their parents were also white, and their parents also came from the farming class back east, which meant when they moved west to California, their parents had land to sell that became capital when they got to California. Yeah. And so this was as much about my grandparents' class as it was about my parents' generation.
Well, let me make also a quick point about generational wealth. The boomers have a unique experience because the generations previous to them, I would have to look up statistics on this, but the generations previous to them, I think, happened to die sooner.
Yes. The modern medicine revolution happened in time to save the boomers.
And as you pointed out, money begets money, right? So if they accumulated their money in a boom period, they were not only able to weather a recession, but they were then able to grow during the next boom period.
This is an important point.
Money during a recession are able to use that as an opportunity, right?
Well, so this is an important point. Take your typical white boomer who didn't experience class immiseration during the 90s or the 2000s. Your typical white boomer had parents who owned land and sold their land when they retired.
Yep.
Which meant they inherited something from their parents or got help from their parents to buy a house.
Yep. Absolutely.
Because of the class immiseration that those boomers themselves began to experience, less of their children enjoyed the same advantages that they enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
And those boomers who could protect their children's inheritance did so at the expense of poorer boomers' kids.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with that.
Absolutely.
And
if you
so
white people, if you want to talk about white people and intersectional with this issue, you can also bring in the GI Bill, right? I mean, that's something that that white people have to generate now too.
Biggest part of what I mean by government assistance.
Yes, absolutely.
There were generations of people who went to college because of the GI Bill right after World War II, and whose boomer kids had tremendous advantages that they would not have otherwise had because of it. There is a whole fictional culture called hard-boiled crime fiction about what happened because of this huge influx of money into the white community in the 1950s. And how that had negative how that had both good and bad consequences socially. Ironically, the real crime in the 1950s was committed against rich people who had done horrible things to become rich. And that gets forgotten.
That's unfortunate. We should bring that history back.
The criminal terror of the Depression was people robbing banks, but the people robbing banks weren't stealing from their neighbors; they were stealing from the from the bank's insurance company.
Right.
Yep.
John Dillinger, his entire career, killed one person, a cop who shot at him first as he was leaving a bank he had robbed. But he was murdered by the cops.
New favorite criminal.
Well, but this is what's funny. There are movies made about John Dillinger, all of which portray him as worse than he really was, killing more people than he really killed.
Wow.
portraying
the cops to some degree as heroic.
Yeah. I mean, I find that to be utterly unsurprising, though, because what's the real takeaway is, you know, a lot of the lore from that era was sort of like a Robin Hood type mentality of you're robbing from the bank, you're not robbing from your neighbors, you're going to give some of that money back to, you know, your fellow people. And that is how movements happen, and we can't have that.
Dillinger was tremendously popular with working people because he and the other bank robbers went to the working side of town and spent money. The people who made money off of John Dillinger were on the working side of town or the black side of town.
Yeah.
That's one of the real crimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I was reading about Dillinger. I have this weird, like, obsession with this era of history, but it reminds me a lot of pirates, honestly. Like, this is why pirates were such a thing.
Pirates freed slaves.
Yes.
Pirates freed slaves, elected their captains, were burned plantations. The first pirates were squatters whose attempts to settle in Hispaniola was outlawed by the Spanish ruling class, and so they took to living in the wild country in Hispaniola and keeping cattle and pigs and cooking in a sort of jury-rigged oven called a bucan. And from bucan, we get the word buccaneer.
Ooh, neat.
And these illegal colonists built a city called Tortuga, and they appointed a French governor, even though they had no legal status. and their French governor started issuing letters of marque to rob the Spanish.
Have you ever seen the movie Captain Blood?
Yes. That is one of the, and have you ever read the book?
I have read the book, also excellent.
Everyone should, people who have seen the movie may not understand the politics to the same degree they will if they read the book.
So elaborate. Tell everybody about this. I think it's important for people to know this story.
Okay.
Yeah.
Captain Blood is one of the 2 or 3 great novels by the pirate author Raphael Sabatini. The other 2 were The Black Swan and The Seahawk. All 3 of these were made into movies. Captain Blood and The Seahawk with Errol Flynn, and The Black Swan with Tyrone Power. Captain Blood is the most important because it is the most openly political. The main character of Captain Blood is a Scottish doctor, Peter Blood, who treats injured soldiers after the first Jacobite rebellion when King James of Scotland was, no, I'm sorry, I'm getting before this, the first Jacobite rebellion against Charles II, when King James of England was still the Duke of York, and who horribly repressed the rebellion and who horribly repressed the Presbyterians who were rebelling against the English. And because he treated the wounds of a Jacobite officer, he was banished to indentured servitude in the Caribbean and sold to essentially become a slave on a tobacco plantation, and he runs away and becomes a pirate.
Fuck yeah, he does.
And he goes to Tortuga, the city I'm talking about, where he becomes business partners with a Frenchman named Levasseur, who helps him become a pirate captain. And he and Levasseur then have a conflict that becomes the core part of the story, but that's less important than the political part, which is he is disenfranchised for doing his job as a doctor, sentenced to slavery in the Caribbean, and is rescued by the pirates.
And don't they also talk about, I remember this one scene, I wish I remembered it better because I can make the better point, but he's on the ship, he's just become captain, and he's like, you know, he's got this beautiful, like, you know, Robin Hood-esque speech that, you know, he also delivered as Robin Hood. But it's basically like, you know, nobody will ever, own us, and we will share everything equally.
The Free Brotherhood.
Yes, it sounded like it was just like a laundry list of socialist principles.
So
it was
the last unpublished work of David Graeber's that was published was called Pirate Democracy. And it is about the pirate republic in Nassau after all this, when the privateers had been thrown over by the British government and had to form their own government to try to survive and were eventually wiped out by the British. But they abolished slavery. They had a strict one-man, one-vote system for electing their ruling council. The ruling council had a strict one-member, one-vote system for electing the admiral. Every captain was elected by his crew. There was a tremendous amount of worker democracy. The crews were represented by a quartermaster, and who, with the crew's support, had the power to change to declare that there had to be a new election for captain. It's just fascinating.
Anytime you can talk about pirates, it's a good day.
Fucking A. I'll have to check that book out. It sounds awesome. I don't mean to change the subject, but do you mind if I ask a question, Phoenix? I don't know. We've just met, and you seem very lovely. And if I say anything that you don't feel comfortable with, like, please tell me. But you are a sex worker, right?
Kind of, sort of retired, but yeah.
Totally, like same. I did a very brief flirtation with sex work, maybe about like 5 to 7 years ago, for only about 6 months. But I was curious to ask your question, to ask you a question, about the conversation of legalizing sex work. Because I think it's an interesting conversation that not a lot of people think about in detail, because there are a lot of sex workers that are against legalization because they fear the police involvement. So I wanted to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, actually, so what most sex worker advocate for is a full decriminalization model, not a legalization model. Just because historically there's been too much essentially bureaucratic red tape and or police and government involvement in surveillance that's really been a problem for sex workers in places where it is legal, because once it becomes legal, suddenly you have to adhere to standards that are kind of randomly imposed by government entities. So that could be anything from like you're only allowed to work in a certain location during certain times of day. You have to work inside of a brothel. You can't work outdoors. Those sort of things. And it becomes even more of a problem because, like, for example, if, where you're working, the legal model says you have to work at a brothel, that means you have to be able to get hired into a brothel, right?
Yeah.
So now, like, depending on your body type, you may not get hired into a brothel. If you have a previous arrest record, you may not get hired into you know what I'm saying? Like, because now you have to get someone to hire you, and that may just not be a possibility.
And of course, any situation that privileges a certain working situation is is one that privileges the bosses in that working situation.
Mm-hmm.
Which, and of course, and this is important because this is what I see happening if we had a legalization. Los Angeles, which is the porn capital of the world, has a police department which is one of the most vicious police departments in the country, right?
Right.
Now, the LAPD is responsible for making sure that the porn producers in the porn capital of the world follow all the porn rules. And to do this, they have a department called Administrative Vice. And what is not known is that any porn producer big enough to be making any amount of money is in an almost constant contact with the police to make sure they're not breaking the rules.
Right.
In a way that in many ways amounts to legalized administrative harassment and bullying.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I'm not trying to say that porn producers are all wonderful people because of their identity. I'm trying to point out the way the system works. If you believe that pornography is a predatory industry, then you should also understand that predatory cops being predatory against the predators make the industry more predatory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just something that we've seen time and time again in different countries. I mean, even legal models here, like Nevada, is just an absolute disaster. Where to work in certain brothels in Nevada, you have to like be essentially put on a government watch list. So they know where you are. Like, it's not great. So what we generally advocate for is decriminalization over legalization, because if you can't meet the requirements for whatever reason, then you're still working criminalized and you're still in danger. And then even if you are working legalized, you are still under essentially state surveillance and police harassment.
There was recently a big union fight in Belgium where the sex workers union wanted to make sure they still had the right to refuse service to customers, and the brothel owners were trying to push for a minimum number of customers they had to say yes to.
Yeah,
that's not.
The union won.
The union did win. I'm so proud of them.
That's great.
Yeah. Actually,
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say real quick, one of the other like awesome things about Belgium, I don't know how many people are like aware of it. I don't know how many people follow sex worker politics, but one of the really cool things about Belgium, aside from the union winning, is what types of victories they got. So now also sex workers can do things like get paid maternity leave. They can qualify for pensions. You know what I mean? Like, it's just really, really great. I'm
Their
very happy.
bosses have to treat them like actual workers.
Yes.
Which they are. And have to act like actual responsible bosses, which legally they are.
Yeah,
so
I support it.
yeah, I mean, like that's an entirely different story than the one you were just telling, though, right? I mean, like, how do we get from decriminalization to, the reality in which sex work is treated just as normal work? You know, that's a legitimate question. I don't know.
Yeah. So they did actually decriminalize in Belgium. I think a big part of the issue with sex workers is there's so much stigma around it. It makes it hard to like get sort of into the weeds and like these type of conversations. But ultimately, if you start removing penalties for doing sex work, then all of a sudden you have the ability to be like, okay, now what can we create? How can we create a more equitable system? How can we create a safer system? How can we push forward, with a harm reduction model, which is really, ultimately what we want is just removal of criminal penalties for sex work.
Sex workers have the same rights to use a bank as anybody else, for instance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a big thing that people don't understand in terms of when we talk about stigma and sex work and how criminalization impacts sex workers. I think people only think about like someone getting arrested strictly for prostitution and going to jail for that or getting fined or whatever the case is. But it's like so much more expansive because if what you're doing is seen as criminal, now you're at risk of having your kids taken away. Now you're at risk of getting evicted, if you do have a record,
be debanked if they find out where your money comes from.
Exactly. And if you can't participate with banking institutions, how do you participate in the economy? And all these things are driving it further underground. And so we're really trying to focus more so on getting rid of those type of restrictions and criminalizations and penalties so that like that's how we can move forward. Because right now it's just as long as there's a criminal element, which would still happen under legalization because not everyone's going to be able to work legally. It's just sort of like self-defeating in that sense. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, I love that answer. Thank you. That's a great answer. Also,
every time I hear the word legalization, I just think of the LAPD's Administrative Vice Division, and that does it every time.
Yeah, that's insane, man. And so I wanted to ask you also about because another issue from what I could see is regular health checks. Isn't that a part of the Nevada system?
Yeah.
Yeah, that frightens me considering the state of gynecology just as a patron of it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, is that a huge issue?
I don't think that we should have health checks, honestly. I think that if you would like to see a provider, you can ask them and they can provide you with receipts of their more recent health checks if you're worried about it. But making it mandatory to me is a bad idea. It worries me on a few levels. One, as you pointed out, the state of gynecology is an absolute disaster. As we're also seeing more restrictions on abortion, that also kind of freaks me out. I would like to go to the doctor a little bit less, but also I think it feeds into the stigma, the idea that sex workers are somehow like inherently more like dirty than other people. And it's like regular people get STDs all the time, have unplanned pregnancies all the time. It's not something that's like unique to sex workers. And I feel like it's sort of like a stigmatizing approach to be like, well, because you do sex work, you have to have checkups so often.
Exactly.
Excellent point.
So, so that's something that kind of like freaks me out about it. And then also like, I do wonder about like what the long-term consequences of that are. I remember a story from a couple of years ago about a woman. She was not a sex worker, by the way, but she had been sexually assaulted and, basically went in to get medical care, and her insurance provider denied some of the claims because they basically argued that she'd been too promiscuous in the past. So they didn't want to cover some of her, medications and treatments after she had been sexually assaulted that, she was trying to take preventative measures. And like, that freaks me out. Like, if your insurance company can do that and they know you're a sex worker, like, they will never cover anything for you ever. Like whether it's like sexual health related or just general health related. So like that kind of thing is on the back of my head a lot when I think about it.
I don't like any system of government regulation that gives too many private corporate interests access to people's information and in a position to sell it or turn it over to the cops.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it just seems like fodder for like mass abuse to me. Like it seems.
And also, sorry, just one more thing that freaks me out about is a lot of times, because this is under a legal model where you have these health checks, I would just again point out in the United States, we do not have universal health care. What happens if you can't afford to get your health check and now you're working criminally because you didn't hit the legal mandate, and now like that's a whole other can of worms.
Exactly. Administrative mandates without institutional funding are, again, it's just something that puts a cop over your shoulder.
Yeah, and if you're talking about forced gynecological examinations, that to me sounds like a perfect transition into like a mass sexual abuse model, a institutionalized sexual abuse model, and certainly could lead to disturbing things with experimentation from like new medical treatments and whatnot. I mean, the sex worker population is a very vulnerable population for that.
And
I agree with all that. I would also add on to that a lot of times people assume that anti-sex worker policy won't affect them, but it almost always does, especially if you're a woman. So if we're starting with the idea that it's okay to force some people to undergo mandatory gynecological exams or mandatory health exams, that's going to be all women, like especially at the rate we're going with watching abortion bans and the way that the GOP is behaving in terms of women's rights. I can absolutely see it's something that started with sex workers and then is gradually spread out to other women who are not sex workers. It's going to be women who are at risk. So women who are homeless, women who are in poverty, and then it's going to keep expanding and keep expanding and keep expanding from there. And that's something
I agree.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Well,
I wanted to say because that like in some ways the sex worker community is a lot more vulnerable, and because of that is sort of a litmus test, or not a litmus test, a early indicator, a bird in the coal mine. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, sex workers really are canaries in the coal mine for so many things.
Marginalized and stigmatized people get it worse. Sex workers have been deliberately targeted as part of the broad stigmatization of poverty for a long time. White liberals started the idea of the welfare state with the idea that the most important thing about the welfare state would be the control of moral hazard, and therefore getting help had to be so onerous that only people who really needed help would get it. And therefore, getting help meant stigmatization and hard work, usually painful hard work.
To the point where it's near impossible. Like, I absolutely agree with that. And that principle is present in every level of trying to get assistance. Every step of it.
And this kind of stigmatization of poverty is always accompanied by a police state crackdown on criminalized work.
Yeah.
If they want everybody to be poor, then they crack down harder on property theft because they don't want people to stop being poor by stealing. Keep in mind, in this era of great social liberalism of the workhouse and the Poor Act and the treadmill, this was also when they hanged thieves in London. Sex workers could be abused and victimized and killed in a large number of ways. The first famous serial killer case, Jack the Ripper, preyed on sex workers and was never caught.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can I just like my own little like personal beef about the Jack the Ripper. I hate how that's framed as the case that became sort of like the beginning of criminology. And like this is, you know, how the criminal justice system reforms because this is, you know, we had to learn how to catch criminals because of Jack the Ripper. Can I tell you how many sex workers are still murdered to this day and police do not give a single solitary fuck? If one person tells me that Jack the Ripper, like, and that's why we have, you know, criminology, just stop fucking playing in my face.
Hey, no, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to say something in response to that too.
Phoenix, I just had a well said that.
The response to Jack the Ripper was not what we call modern criminology and criminalistics. The response to Jack the Ripper was this wacko psychosocial theory called alienism. And alienism was this weird psychological idea that if you could understand the ways in which the killer had been alienated from society, you would then be able to understand why crime happens and eliminate crime.
Oh,
and
yeah, that's silly. That's very silly.
And that is not where our modern criminalistics came from. Our modern criminalistics came from things like being able to match bullets to guns to catch bank robbers and things like that. Property crimes that people cared about.
Let me ask you another question about the Jack the Ripper case, Chris. Because I feel like you know this. You're like an encyclopedia. Like, is that one of the first cases in which they performed autopsies on female corpses?
So that gets more complicated. I'm not so much up on the history of all of that end of forensics. I know that autopsies were really, really generally verboten in Victorian society, and that a lot of Victorian doctors were still buying their bodies from what they called resurrection men, body snatchers,
right.
People who stole them from graveyards.
Right.
I don't know if they started really doing forensic autopsies during Jack the Ripper or not. I do believe they did some examination of bodies, but I don't think they really did what we would consider a forensic autopsy. It had more to do with, again, the weird psychosocial alienism theory, ideas about how the victim was dressed and where they were when they were died and what kind of person they were and how this elicited rage from the killer, blah, 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 blah.
Sure. Well, no, I bring that up because I think it's interesting in the history of gynecology because there is so much that we still don't know about the female body because they have been so reluctant to cut open female corpses for so long.
Mm-hmm.
What were you going to say, Phoenix?
Oh, I was going to just say that, like, there's a lot of speculation that had Jack the Ripper victims not been sex workers, that they would not have gotten, like, as much of an autopsy as they were capable of at that point in time.
Yeah, that's
very
true.
Have even less of an autopsy? I would feel like that they would be, like, their bodies would be garbage and therefore would have, like, full autopsy, no?
It has to do with Victorian ideas of respectability and respectable women. You would never disgrace the body of a respectable housewife. But who cares about street riffraff?
Right. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, that actually was a thing. Yeah, there was actually, and I forget which one of the victims it was now, but there was actually like some speculation about whether or not she was actually a sex worker, because most of the victims were like full-time sex workers, and like often struggling with homelessness. But one of the victims, like, kind of only did it a little bit on the side, like just as like an extra money type thing. And so like what they think. Mm-hmm.
There was this sort of thing like, and I don't want to cut into to internal beefs or anything like that, but it was like the argument you would see now where, is she a real sex worker or is she an OnlyFans girl who occasionally sees a fan?
Yeah, that's kind of that's literally what the conversation was at the time. And so it was like interesting to see how that stigma played out specifically with her murder. And then how, like, ultimately it was decided, well, if she did it once, then it's the same thing as being, like, a regular full-time 7-day-a-week sex worker. So she's still a piece of trash, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting.
Well,
Yeah,
you
I'll have
have
to go back and look and find her name. I don't remember which victim it was.
well, the Victorian problem with sex work was the problem with female sexuality itself, and the problem with sex itself, and the fact that women were the ones who were making money from this, and that by making money this way, they were escaping their proper sphere of home and house, which of course was ridiculous because poor women had a choice between sex work and raising children to die in factories.
Well, one can make an argument that over the history of sex work in general, that women have found freedom from patriarchal systems. And I think you can make that argument specifically from the period in Vienna where sex workers had like like legal status and shit, and they were like they were able to have their own houses and own their own properties and stuff. I mean, like they there are, I think there's definitely a long history of that.
Well, but I mean, even in the period of time where King Louis the 15th's official mistress was essentially a sex worker who was running the country, the poor sex worker in Paris was still being killed by the gendarme.
Right. It's intersectional, absolutely. And but that's the other thing too, is like when you talk about sex work, you're really talking about such a broad, sort of category in which literally almost anything physical can be kind of be thrown into it. Like you definitely consider a mistress a sex worker, but you could also say that she's definitely different from a brothel sex
Well,
worker.
so the official mistress in France was a little different than being, rich John Doe's mistress today. The official mistress in France was a government position with a house and a paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about royal mistresses, we're not talking about somebody's side piece in the modern sense, at least in the way it's understood in the modern sense. We're talking about an official government position that was paid for as a government job, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we should bring that back, by the way.
I'm sorry?
I said I think we should bring that back.
Yes.
I mean, it was so wide ranging at one point that King William II of England, despite the fact that he almost never visited her and spent a lot of time with his wife, and people actually talked about William and Mary of England because most married couples were not close, and people suspected that they might love each other, and that was freaky.
Yep.
And it was really weird when he wouldn't remarry after she died. They hated that. But he kept a royal mistress who he almost never visited simply because that was the thing kings did.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it definitely is the broadest possible category to call someone a sex worker, right? Because you look at the difference. Look at the difference.
I'll go one further. I'll go one further. And this is why it was considered so weird for couples to love each other, especially if they were royal. Marriage was arranged for dynastic or economic reasons in most cases during this period of history.
Right.
Nobody fell in love and got married because they fell in love, unless they were ridiculously rich and had the privilege to buck the rules. And even then it was a scandal and they were stigmatized and often lost their place in society.
Like, I have to think that regardless, and I'm sorry if this is changing the subject, but I have to think that regardless of class, that marriage for women has always been an economic decision, at least.
Engels wrote a book that is underappreciated by Marxists these days. in which he essentially said that marriage under the modern capitalist industrial system is sex work. That the family exists to create an artificial division between labor in the home, which is not paid, and labor outside of the home, which is paid, and assigned, at least in broad theoretical strokes, the role of paid labor outside of the home to men and unpaid labor inside of the home to women. Now, obviously, this is clearly a really good deal for men who are doing all the work that people get paid for, again, in theory, and not as good a deal up front for women who are doing all the real work in the home.
Mm-hmm.
But if you marry a man of the right class, then you can pay a poor woman to do all that for you.
Mm-hmm. Thus,
marriage is sex work.
Yeah, I definitely think you could make that argument.
This was Engels' argument. What's hilarious is that some of the most ardent supporters of Engels were later thrown out of the original Marxist Party in the United States because Karl Marx was a prude and thought that this made them anarchists. And he, in fact, in one of the later editions of Engels' book, Marx convinced Engels, who, it should be understood, frequented sex workers himself, told Engels he should tone down the anti-marriage stuff and advocate male monogamy instead of free love.
Okay.
And in a later edition of the book, Engels said he thought male monogamy would replace the modern system because it would be more fair to women. And that has never really happened the way Engels and Marx said it would.
Because, that's really interesting. I want to look more into that because, like, to me, like love aside, family aside, economically speaking, as a wife, that's a choice that you're making. Like that, like you have as a woman essentially like two choices in life. You can either go into business for yourself, be it sex work or other work, or you can get married. And that's, long been like the question and the dichotomy. And it's long been seen as favorable to get married because that's stable. Especially in a society where women could only own property years.
And the conservative anti-feminist attitudes of many white women are based on the fact that their husband is rich and they can afford to pay someone to do all that work for them. And therefore they feel like they benefit from not having civil rights.
I will say also that that this view of feminism is absolutely white and European in nature. We need to make that caveat that not all forms like this.
And it's funny. I find it ironic that some of the women who advocate for this end up just completely screwed over later in life if the husband actually divorces them. Right? We just saw this recently in Florida, where they changed the alimony laws, and a lot of older white women have a lot of feelings about it. And it's like, how did you not see this coming as the inevitable conclusion of your ideology, though?
Yeah. Right? Why did you listen to Phyllis Schlafly? Didn't you see this coming?
But here we are.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And you're like, that's definitely what I was reaching for too, is that, the stigma about sex workers is ridiculous because we are in a patriarchal system in which women have to be some kind of subsidiary to a man in order to get financial security for themselves. I mean, again, speaking in broad strokes. And, that system creates, like female servitude, whether or not you're having sex. And the point is that you're, you know, if you really view the marriage as something where you have a family unit working together for the benefit of the entire family, then you have to assume that the woman is absolutely being paid partially for having sex and having children, right? And that's insane to me.
I also want to point out that a lot of the ways that this alienates women who make relationship choices based on money from the people they are in relationships with feeds a variety of abuse that we don't talk about enough. Yeah. One of the best examples I can think of is there is currently an international first lady who was so concerned about making a good marriage that she chose to groom a young man she thought would grow up to be president someday.
Yikes.
I'm making a joke about Macron in France and the age difference between him and his wife, and the fact that if you actually look at it, he is a victim of grooming, but has convinced himself he's happy about it.
Wow. Well, that's
a whole other issue. I convinced myself I was happy about it when I was that age too.
Yeah, but I definitely do think that leads into like why there's so much stigma around sex work specifically. It's just women not doing what they're supposed to do and not falling in line the way they're supposed to fall in line, and that's really a problem. It creates too much independence. It creates too much of an opportunity for independent financial means, and it's also like being a bad woman because you're not falling in line with the respectability politics of I just want to stay at home and have babies.
A lot of the money to fund big events during the women's movement of the 70s came from a group nobody talks about today called the WHO, or WHO. WHO stood for whores, housewives, and others. Oh. And while they did do direct organizing and join protests, what was important about the WHO is that these were the folks in the feminist community who had money that they could funnel into feminist activism. Sex workers with money to give to groups organizing protests. Fairly wealthy housewives with money to give to groups overriding protests. Wealthy closeted lesbians. That's who others meant, by the way. Lesbians in an era when they didn't want to say lesbians in the abbreviation. Closeted lesbians from wealthy families who quietly gave money to the women's movement.
Yeah, and I think, like, in the terms of the financial aspect, what always astounds me is the way sex work is criminalized, what that means. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about it in, like, the financial terms, but essentially, criminalization of sex work is punishing women for having sex and making money in ways that they're not supposed to be having sex and making money, and the direct punishment for that is men quite literally taking your money. That's why like, so much of prostitution results in fines, results in jail time, right? Like, so yeah, you get arrested most likely by a male cop. You have to stand most likely in front of a male judge, and they take your money that you made because you made it the wrong way.
And the cop probably rapes you, and if the cop rapes you in the process, then that is considered, consensual sex because you're a sex worker.
Exactly. So it's always sort of fascinating to me how the direct punishment for sex work is for them to take your money because they don't approve of the way that you made your money in the first place.
But not even just that, to take your money and commit a crime that they think of as having sex with you.
Yes. I mean, that is the patriarchy at its finest. No. I also want to bring up a different point about sex work and why there's a stigma, and I think that it's kind of something we really don't talk about. I think that the patriarchy encourages men not to feel in a lot of capacity, not to deal with their emotional selves, and not
So
deal with their
patriarchy
psychological.
stigmatizes male emotion.
Yes, exactly. So a lot of men come to sex work for that release. They come for intimacy. They come for you know, even like therapist style conversations sometimes, like, or sometimes they just want a friend and they don't know how else to make one. I mean, there are a lot of reasons besides actual orgasms that people go to sex workers. And to be a sex worker, you have to be not only competent at sex, but you have to be confident at emotional counseling, essentially. And again, it varies and it depends on who you are and your clientele and whatever. But I think that the reason that that the patriarchy and people in general fear the power of a sex worker is because they are in control and in command of their own emotions to the point where they can help you deal with yours. And that is scary as fuck for men. Scary as fuck. I can tell you that just from my dating history. Like, it is a power that men have absolutely no idea, to the point where, like, you know, like the whole ideas of witchcraft going back through history and casting a
Mm-hmm.
spell on me and shit like that. Like, that all of this shit was sexualizing women and sort of trying to articulate that men didn't know how women had this power.
Witchcraft
Had this.
witchcraft was also about erasing. I'm going to sound more new agey than I want to, but
Oh my God,
the
please.
the whole witchcraft thing is a phenomenon in which men were trying to specifically erase an historical connection between women and the spiritual that was left over from paganism, that they felt that they had to extirpate from Christianity in order to create the Christian society that they wanted.
You're definitely right about that. There is definitely an entirely different conversation to be had about witchcraft, and I would love to have it with you one day because I love the history of witchcraft. But actually, the people started accusing people of being heretics before they were accusing people of being witches. It sort of grew from that, and actually it targeted both
Which
men.
period are you talking about?
I'm
Because
talking about I'm talking about medieval times. I'm talking about like the early medieval ages,
because
before
there was the
witch burning eras, right? Like the witch burning eras was the Renaissance, but I'm talking
much.
about
Yeah,
pre
the
pre.
throw her in the pool to see if she shrinks, if she sinks era, before
Right,
the witch burning era. Yeah.
right, yes, exactly. I mean, so I'm not saying that being called a heretic wasn't used against women who were independent. It absolutely was, but that didn't develop into being called a witch and having it be associated with I'm not just femininity, but anti-patriarchy, as
It's
gay men were also burned as uh, quote unquote the F word faggots, right? Pieces of wood that literally I read in a report one day that said that they were foul enough to burn a witch on, that it would produce a smoke foul enough to burn a witch on.
but yes, if
So the rejection of the patriarchy is really interesting to me,
well,
and the
yeah,
organization.
that's
Yeah,
the term. The term. If you've the F word, if you have ever read Grimm's fairy tales, the
Mm-hmm.
original meaning of the F word is a bundle of sticks wrapped in twine.
well, that's what
Yeah.
I'm saying. That
Yep.
literally the reason they call gay men faggots
Because they
is
burned them. Yes,
they
exactly.
would produce a smoke foul enough to burn a witch on. And that's where
Hmm.
that came from. That they would
Hmm.
that's what they would do with gay guys. That they would throw them on the pile.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I think we went off on a whole tangent there, but you know, when we're talking about independence from the patriarchy and trying to, you know, I definitely think that it's related, and I certainly believe that sex workers were accused of being witches, and I think that there's a lot to be said for, you know, sex workers in during the witch trial era. So that would be an interesting conversation, also. But we don't
Well,
have
and
to.
witches, people who were accused of being witches were also frequently accused of being sex workers, whether they were or not. The two often
Right?
went together.
Yeah, or at the very least, adulterers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Promiscuous women.
Right. So, but that goes back
It's
to my point
important.
about
It's
the
important to understand that many of the terms for sex workers originally referred to any promiscuous woman, and were then stuck on sex workers.
right.
Exactly.
So that goes back to my point about emotions and emotional vulnerability, and how, and I really feel like the fact that they seized on the supernatural in that way. I mean, it was kind of a perfect storm of events, partially also because of I think King James's interest in witchcraft popularized the idea of witchcraft.
King James was the one who bankrolled Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General.
Yes,
King James wrote a book on how to know if you were really burning the right witch.
the Maleficus Maleficarum, right?
No, he didn't write that one. He
Oh,
didn't
not
write
that
that one, but he was a big fan of it, and he wrote his own book about witch hunting.
one. Okay. Yes, I remember that now that you say it. And he's also the reason that I believe he's also the reason there were witches in Macbeth.
Yes, that is part of it, and also
Yeah.
the Neil Gaiman made King James the villain of his Marvel Comics in Virginia Dare story, in which mutants were witches. He made King James the bad guy because since mutants were going to be witches, obviously the great witch hunter would hate mutants.
That's pretty cool. I gotta check that out. But can we go back to what I was saying for a second about emotional vulnerability?
Yes.
I really like to get your opinion on that, Phoenix.
I do think that's a very big part of it. I do see even now, like getting tied into the whole like mysticism and the witchcraft thing. I find that that's a lot of the porn addiction conversation now is rooted in that same type of thing, right? The assumption that no
Yes.
normal man would be into porn that way, like the whole so porn addiction side to it, and it is a lot about emotional vulnerability for men. And I think doubly so, not just because so many men go see sex workers as a form of companionship or to find someone to talk to, that happens way more frequently than people even estimate. But also what types of services men seek besides the emotional, because it does take a certain amount of emotional vulnerability to essentially do like some kinky stuff, you know? There's sort of like
Yeah.
an emotional difference between having like straight sex, you know, just like regular, regular heteronormative sex versus like, I want to dress up like a woman and I want you to spank me or something. You know what I mean? Like that's a very different type of sexual encounter, and a lot of men are very embarrassed about the desires that they have. And so I think between like the emotional aspect of talking and finding friends and finding companionship, in addition to some of the sexual services that people request, that ties together, I think.
This is the person I trust to let see this side of me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And
that's the point. And I definitely think that it also goes back to bucking the patriarchy, right? Because those desires are verboten for a reason, right?
exactly.
Please continue.
So I think that it's definitely tied in with the emotional aspect, and I think it's also there's a sort of like a unique level of punishment. Obviously, sex workers bear much more of the burden of punishment due to criminalization, things like that. But oftentimes, even men who are clients of sex workers are still seen as like, well, you must be some sort of like depraved rapist if you want to see a sex worker, or you must be so like socially incompetent that you can't get a wife or you can't get a girlfriend or you can't date like a normal person. There is actually a lot of stigma that men who see sex workers face, and I think that's part of it.
All the slurs that I'm subjected to every time I say, but what are they supposed to do to make as much money?
Yeah. It's a mess. But I do think that like the sort of stigma that clients have to deal with is also tied into the emotional aspect, because the thing is, if that's your kink, that's your kink. You know what I'm saying? And generally, people feel better when they explore those kinks, when they engage in those kinks, because, you know what I'm saying? Because they did allow themselves to be emotionally vulnerable, because they were honest about, this is something that really turns me on and I really enjoy this specific activity. And overall makes them more, I think, healthy and well-rounded in general. And I think that other men have animosity for men who have found a way to sort of emotionally regulate. So I think that's also where like a lot of the stigma against clients comes in, is because like, how dare you be an emotionally regulated person and you found out that you can be that way by going to see a sex worker, talking to her, and, you know, letting her peg you or whatever your thing is, you know? And so I think like there's a lot of layers to the stigma that men who see sex workers face because of that. You know, and I think that is like the whole, if you talk to people who are anti-sex work, they always have these like fucking weirdo ass, like violent fantasies, you know, to be like, he doesn't actually care about you. He just wants to like rape you. And it's like, no, what?
And how gleeful did liberals get about Stormy spanking Trump with a rolled up newspaper?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah.
No, it wasn't a rolled newspaper. It was a Time magazine with his own fucking face on the cover.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I like that.
That is so on brand. Oh my God.
But liberals loved this, like him being humiliated like this, because that's how they see it, because, you know, his secrets are coming out in the public. That him being humiliated like this and having his vulnerability exposed like this made them feel better in a visceral, personal way that had nothing to do with what kind of a president he was.
Exactly. That to me is like similar to how for a while they were obsessed with doing the like the rainbow memes of him and Putin. And I was like, of all the things wrong with the guy, the idea that he might be gay or have some homoerotic fascination with someone else is like literally the least of my worries right now. The absolute least of them. But, you know, the idea is that when somebody steps out of line, especially sexually, that you should be allowed to humiliate them and denigrate them and abuse them, because, you know, you can't act that way. You only have to have sex a certain way and you can't step outside of that. So,
right.
Did anyone else have any other questions? Because I do have to run.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm good. I just wanted to thank you, and it's awesome to meet you. And you made so many excellent points, and I really appreciate it. I'm so glad, also, Chris, that you let us have this conversation a little bit too, because I've wanted to talk to another pro-sex worker feminist for a while now, to work out some of these kinks. So I appreciate your enlightening me.
No, thank you so much. This was awesome. We should do it again sometime. Thank you for having me on. I do appreciate it. And yeah.
Always my pleasure, and expect to be invited again. My dream still is for my other co-host Renee to be able to come back and for us to have a show with her, but I know she's got stuff going on and I don't want to push her before she's ready.
Gotcha. But yeah, it was super nice to meet you. I'm always on Twitter, so you can always find me there.
That's true. She's almost as chronically online as me.
It's terrible. I have a problem.
It's not terrible, because you're one of the. I mean, I can honestly say that your tweets have been making my day better for almost as long as I've been on Twitter now.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, you're still like one of the first people I followed, and one of the first people I was excited when they followed me back.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot.
No, I just wanted to say that. I don't think I said that the last time I had you on the show, and I wanted to say that before we wrapped up today.
Thank you. All right, but I am going to run. It was a pleasure, and I'll talk to y'all again soon.
Talk to you soon. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Stay safe out there.
You too.
Stay safe. And Bess, do you have any final thoughts before I wrap us up?
Oh, I don't know. I talked enough, I think, but you go ahead and wrap up.
Oh, I don't know. I broke in plenty too. So
But this discussion, I mean, every discussion I have with you, I feel like at the end of it, I'm like, wow, this was a great discussion.
I try to really I want people to learn stuff and understand stuff and sort of get something out of it. So I really want to try to make good conversations happen. I feel like if we have conversations that we can get stuff out of, then our audiences should be getting something out of it too, right?
100%. 100%. I think we have great conversations, Chris.
And
Seriously.
that's my goal, is to bring people good conversations that they can listen to, and on a reasonably interactive day feel like they're taking part in, and talk about during the week afterwards. And I think this talking is important, and that's why I keep doing it. And thank you for helping me do it. I appreciate it. And
Well, thank you for letting me.
it's my pleasure. And I hope everyone out there has a great week. I hope you think about some of the stuff we've spoken about. And I hope everybody has a safe week, and that we're all able to come together again a week from now. Until then, I'll tweet at you.
Thank you.